Hello and welcome to another episode of the Clark Smith podcast. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Neal Mann, co-founder of NOAN, an AI superhuman business partner, early stage business. Now, a little bit of a cheat. Neil and I have known each other for a little while because we actually went to school together. We were talking about this the other day. Was it 25 years ago? That makes
Yeah.
me feel old. But we won't go back there. Um, Obviously, our paths after school kind of went in very different directions. I did philosophy at university. You went up north and did archaeology, I believe, and then went into media. So tell me a little bit about that kind of early stage of your career and archaeology to news reporting at the coalface, really.
Yeah, it sounds like a strange journey, and in some ways it was, but in many ways it will make sense how I went from archaeology to where I'm at today, really. For me, I came out of school, deeply interested in history and human behavior and societal change. Archaeology is not what most people think it is. Really, you're actually looking at the science of human behavior. It's it edges on anthropology. It looks at obviously the historic aspect. And so for me, it was a natural way into doing something that kind of scratched that itch in many ways. And then from there, I left archaeology, realized there's not many actual jobs in archaeology itself specifically, but was shooting climbing movies and I was filming climbing movies. I'm a big climber. Somebody said to me, you like the news, you shoot climbing movies, why don't you go and become a broadcast journalist? And with that, the next day I got up and applied for a master's in broadcast journalism at Sheffield Uni and then went straight from there to Sky News. And that was my kind of journey into the news business. And it's interesting because for me, I look back on my archaeology degree quite a lot because, when I was in the news business and when you're building product, really what you're doing is understanding how humans behave.
Mm.
And that is actually fundamental to both of those things.
Yeah.
And you're looking for the story, the understanding of how things are done, the trends, all of that is there in whether it's product or news. And for me, like a lot of that was set in that very early kind of degree that I did in archaeology. And so it's not quite as random to see that pathway all the way through to kind of product as I am now via news.
I mean, human behavior is, I mean, in the recruitment field, you go to search, it's critical because we're looking at how humans behave in different scenarios. It's something I'm deeply passionate about as well. I suppose some of the things that you did, certainly in that early news career, field producer, riots, the Arab Spring uprising, you're really at the coalface and very different environments. How did that shape, I suppose, what you'd almost been taught and learned about human behavior? Because seeing it right at those real crunch extreme moments must have been quite eye-opening and different.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to it actually. There's what you see when you're in those environments and what you learn about people in that experience and society at large. And that ranges from individuals you're meeting to experiences you're having. And then there's also what you learn about how you behave under immense stress and pressure. And there probably is, I think there's very few jobs that are as dangerous, but also extreme pressure as like 24-hour foreign news in particular. And my hat goes off to a lot of my friends who still do that career because you're working in a 24-hour news environment, which in itself, even if you're doing domestic news, is insanely stressful. You're working minute by minute, moving the news forward, ultimately living on adrenaline. But then at the same time, you might be doing that in a foreign news environment, and you learn a lot about you and how you behave and the pressures you're under once you're in a really dangerous environment, still doing that same job. And so I found those two camps of understanding kind of society and then understanding me and how I behaved were really fundamental then in kind of where I went next. But just to dive a little bit deeper, I think you know, even if you just look at the politics of today, I think very many people don't really understand how society operates at large. I
Mm.
think very many people understand, like, whether that's democracy, what happens when democracy goes away, when society falls apart. If you have an understanding of that and you see it, you have a sense of kind of how people are pulling the strings in certain parts of the world to kind of make society do what they wanted to do or move in a particular direction. And also the fragility of
Mm.
many of the environments that we're in. But at the same time, you see like, you just meet incredible people and you meet people. One of the greatest things about that job in journalism is that I have met everybody from people who are completely down and out out of their luck, both whether internationally in a horrible environmental situation or domestically, all the way through to A-list celebrities, world leaders. You cover the whole um, spectrum, and you just realize that like people are pushed by very much the same buttons, whether they're
Mm.
up to the spectrum. And ultimately, we're all individuals that behave in particular ways based on kind of um, who we are inherently, I think.
I, it's quite an interesting thought I had around that. Obviously, back then, misinformation was disseminated in a very different way. And I know you took, sort of set up live Twitter feeds minute by minute to I suppose counter some of this. How do you see that that's changed now or changing now in an AI generated way? Because I think that's a fear of a lot of people is that actually we're going to be flooded by AI generated content with an agenda behind it because actually the volume side of it is so much easier now. But back then, Arab Spring, yes, there's a lot of it, but at the same time, it was harder to create the volume of it in that respect.
Yeah, so I was at an interesting time in journalism. I came through journalism late 2000s, and my career really took off around 2009, which is when kind of the Arab Spring started to happen and social media really took hold. And I was one of the young then journalists who understood that this fundamentally changed two things. One, how we news gathered, how we gathered information from what was happening on the ground. Because typically it would have been either you would have had to been there before mobile phones and social media, or a news crew from the AP or Reuters or somebody would have picked up the footage locally, or somebody would have reported locally, and you would have taken it from there. It fundamentally changed how we news gathered, and it fundamentally changed how we communicated with people. And what I mean by that is it shifted from being brand communication to mass market to individuals being part of a brand communicating to other individuals. So what I mean is journalists all of a sudden could use their Twitter feeds and communicate directly to people on the ground and build their own mini audiences. And this trend obviously came through into the corporate world, and we can talk about that later. But now you'll see it every organization,
Mm.
every their own micro followings across all the different employees. But in journalism at the time, that shift was huge, and I was lucky to capitalize on it. I became known for being a kind of, in many ways, kind of a center of truth of curating what was happening in these places and verifying it, and then retweeting it and posting it and putting it out there. Um, and I think at the time it was it was fascinating to me because people were looking for, everyone was going through the same thing. If you weren't a
Mm.
journalist, you were still seeing all of this stuff on your social media feeds and you were trying to work out what was new and what was real. So you were going to individuals who could verify it or organizations who could verify it. And they were obviously getting a lot of following, like myself, a lot of credibility for doing that. The difference now, I think, is that well, there's two things that have happened. The sheer prevalence of content that could be created at scale with AI is almost unimaginable.
Yeah.
But second of all, we've seen a lot of in the US, UK, a lot of attacks on the media. I think people have lost their respect for the likes of the BBC, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, traditional media, or what people like to term mainstream media, that does an incredible job of actually verifying content on the ground and actually speaking truth to power in many ways. Um, they've been kind of vilified, and as a result, like people are now unsure. They don't want to trust what they say is real, and you're going to end up with this massive AI content that's
Mm.
really not. Um, and I think the space now for verification is probably in like people are going to build tools that enables it to
Yeah.
happen. That's the most likely thing, right? That's the only way it could potentially be solved, is that there's actual tools that will verify and tell you immediately whether something is real or not. And I think that's where we're going to end up going. So, that shift to AI is really taking the power away
Yeah.
from individuals doing it all the way going now to it's going to need to be done at like a platform level.
And do you think this is what was the foundational element of your idea of a single source of truth? I know when we talk about known, that is something that you fundamentally believe. So do you think this is kind of really the foundation of where this idea, this concept got embedded as having a single source of truth, having the credibility authority rather than looking from different sources?
In some ways, but I would say that was more formed. So I moved from the UK to the US market and went from Sky News to the Wall Street Journal, where I came over to work on social and then editorial innovation and led editorial innovation there. And then from there, I was asked to go work for News Corp, which is the parent company, restructuring as part of the team in Australia, restructuring the business around subscription. And now, one of the most important things there was that a lot of the foundations we were putting in place were to bring, News Corp in Australia has, I think it might even be 100 brands. It's got all the things that you wouldn't even, maybe even more, 'cause it's got local titles, it's got Golf Monthly, it's got Vogue, it's got all these things you wouldn't even expect. Bring them all onto the same platform, create the same content API that could be leveraged so you could easily build products quickly, take the business through corporate transformation. I learned a lot of those skills in that environment.
That's systemization and productization.
Yeah, systemization and structure, like architecture. My desk buddy there was a great guy called Adam Thomas, who was global head of architecture at News Corp, and we sat next opposite each other. And part of our job as a leadership team was to work out the future of how we would communicate with customers, and then what that needed to be done to architect. And I think that is where the initial kernel for me on organizations needing a single source of truth
Mm.
started to be clear because architecturally you need it. You can't have like 100 different platforms all operating in different ways. You need a single one if you're going to bring everybody together and operationalize it. And then once I left News Corp, I got a job at Anomaly, heading up a consulting division of global agency. Anomaly is a global creative agency, leading transformation. So working on membership, subscription, product, content, very much similar to what I did at News Corp with cross-functional teams,
Mm.
but with clients ranging from Microsoft to Allied Bank to New York Life. And I think the one thing that if you spent a lot of time in the corporate world, the one thing you will recognize is that every single corporate business is an absolute shit show. And and that's where when you're doing that job and you're bringing cross-functional teams together, you start to realize that, like, hang on a second, like the UX team is referring to something in this way, and the brand team is
Mm.
referring to in this way, and you've got the product team thinking they're talking about the same thing but using completely different language. And there's no there's no set definition. There's no one knows quite what the strategy is. I've never walked into a global company where everyone knows what the strategy is, ever. Ever. And you won't, right? Like, honestly, I've worked with a lot of you will never do that. You have leadership teams who don't quite know what the strategy
Yeah.
is. Sat down with them and asked them who is our target customer and what is our approach and what is it? They wouldn't be able to tell you. Each of them would come back with some answer. Someone will probably pull a design persona out. You're like, well, no, I'm talking about audience segmentation. So that was where I really understood that, like, one of the fundamental problems in business is that if you are to add AI into that, it will not make it better. It will, in
Mm.
fact, actually probably make it worse because AI relies on facts and understanding what it's a knowledge referencing
Yeah.
machine, ultimately, what the knowledge is. And so that was where I really started to cement that there needed to be a new approach to how we thought about this and how we approach business. And in many ways, yes, that led from, like, if you've come from being an ex-journalist, one of the things you are good on is understanding how to write clear definitions of things and your language, you should structure it and you can define things really clearly. So there is an element of that. But I think for me, it was just experiencing so many businesses across so many sectors that are supposedly, obviously some of the world's best and seeing just what of a mess they're in. That was where that came from.
And you had unenviable job of transformation in these organizations. I mean, we started talking about behavioral change, human behavior. And I know I've seen it in many different organizations myself, but your job was to essentially change organizational behavior. What did you see in that anomaly time as global head of transformation, working with these huge corporate organizations as an outsider? And how did you start to mold and change and transform?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you see is that none of these companies have a vision. Literally, I mean, I'll be honest with you, none of them have a vision. And every single year you'll see, stock prices fall. And most of the time it's because the company's not led by a leadership team that actually knows what the vision is or has a direct vision. You see a new tech company come up and the CEO or the founder has a clear vision of where they're going. Whereas a lot of these companies have been around for a long, long time. And as a result, like the vision has got lost. No one's quite sure. And you see that straight away. And you're sat with C-suite and they recognize it. They might not know what the vision is. They don't quite know what they're doing. Some companies have never even developed and I mean vision from a, high level perspective. What are we as a company? Where do we put ourselves in the market? What product should we invest in? What should our M&A strategy be? All of those things fall out of actually knowing what type of company you're building. So the first thing you see is that, and you see that inherently across all of them. And one of the reasons the consulting industry exists is because they go into these companies to try and help them supposedly define that. So, you see that. The other thing you see at length across every single organization like that is you'll see what someone once said to me that they called it the frozen middle, which I think is the
Mm,
best way to explain it. You'll have the C-suite want to change and they want to move forward and they know they have to. There's market pressures, there's share price pressures, they've got to move forward. Young staff are coming in and they want to change. And they're at the bottom, they're the bottom of the stack. And they're like, right, there's a new way. I can see new technologies coming in and changing this. And I was one of those people in the news industry, right? Like who saw social starting to change it. It's coming in from the bottom up. But there's a huge frozen middle of people who might have been in the company a long time. They might have a mortgage to pay. They might be 5 years away from retirement. You're not changing their mind. And that's one of the biggest barriers that I think a lot of C-suite do not understand about what transformational change really takes is yes, you need a vision, but you need a way to actually move your business on, and you need a way to activate and thaw that frozen middle and get them moving in the way that you want. And what you typically see is organizations will, they'll let a lot of people go, and I don't necessarily think that is the best approach because you end up losing a lot of organizational knowledge and history. Whereas what you're better doing is trying to set a direction of where the company is going to go and then carving out sectors of the company who can move you in that direction so that then that frozen middle starts to see the direction that the company is moving in, learning from it, and they can see that people are benefiting from these changes, and you can start to then add it to the rest of the organization. And one of my bosses at News Corp said something to me, which has always stuck with me, and I've always said it to every client who's trying to change a business, which is you can only change three areas of business at once. Any more than that, and it's too much swirl. So,
mm,
I'm talking foundational changes around like how you think about product, how you organize, how you go to market, big foundational things. Like, for example, a move to subscription might be one. That's
mm,
a huge transformational change for a lot of organizations. He always said you can only change three areas at once. And I think that holds true, to be honest, for the whole organization, or if you're just working within a unit trying to lead
mm,
transformational change, is actually there's three things. And so what we would always do is we would pick off what those three most important things are that get us to our goal, and then focus on different business areas to execute one of those three things, not one business area to execute three.
yeah.
So you'll get swirl and B is too much. Whereas if you go to a business area and say, right, we're going to change one thing, and we're going to implement this, and you guys are leading the charge, and then you go to another business area and say, we're going to implement this, which aligns with that, you guys are in charge, and then another one say, we're going to implement this, and you give them a clear vision of where you're going, why you're doing it, how it integrates, and then you give them the step-by-step plan to move them forward, they each start to implement it. And then it becomes really easy to take the learnings and move that across other business
Mm.
areas. And all of a sudden you start to move the business forward. And once those things become, day-to-day changes that have happened, you then just move on to the next three things that are going to get us towards our vision. And that to me was one of the biggest learnings from every organization that I've worked in, was just how you think about defining that vision, and then architecting, getting people to move forward towards it, and what it takes.
We've talked about this in other conversations. The tribe mentality, the three elements of it. You got the kind of hero idea, the peer concept, so doing what other people are doing, and you've got the traditional concept, well, we've always done it this way. And in that example, it sounds like you've got to find the right individuals that are open to that kind of change and doing things differently to help drive things forward. Is that
A
was that?
hundred percent. And I think a lot of businesses, they are sat on talent that wants
Mm,
to stay with the business, wants to help the business grow, but there's an indicator of the people to pick. They're unbelievably frustrated. They're banging at the door. They're saying, we shouldn't be doing it this way. We should be doing it that way. And the sign of a bad manager, in my mind, is to be inside an organization like that and tell them to go away or become frustrated with them because they're saying this is a silly way to do this. Now, what you really want to do is take that energy, take that hero mentality, as you say, foster it, give them the right direction. Okay, like you're right, but let's point you in the right way. Let's get you leading something that's going to
yeah.
lead some change, and then surround them with people who want to be able to take it on themselves. When we started talking about that, to me, it really fits that model, right? Like you
Mm,
need people who can lead that. Because again, like someone said to me, the first person in corporate transformation, the first person who goes through the wall is going to get bloody, right? Which is
mm,
an unfortunate like war analogy, but it is true. And so whoever it is, you need to be aware that like, you are going to get stick from people. People aren't going to like change. Most people don't like doing something that isn't is additional to their day job. That's another reality that like
mm,
everyone forgets. Is like if this is your day job, you don't want to do something else that's
yeah,
new. Most people, the frozen middle, don't want to do that, and that's
mm,
okay. But yeah, you need people who are willing to kind of take that pain, but are frustrated. And I always found one thing I always said is like, if I was working with a client, I say, put an email out to the organization. Say, we're looking for people who might have experience in X, or have you ever been frustrated with Y? Raise your hand. And I guarantee before you start looking outside the organization, you'll get a lot of people who put their hand up who've probably got a notebook somewhere where they've been writing ideas for the company
mm,
that should be moved. I guarantee you, any corporate. And so as a result, like you then can pick some of those, and then they've got the institutional knowledge, they understand the traditions, they have the vision, they've got the hero, and then they can help bring their peers along, and they've got
mm.
someone who can become aligned. Now, they may not be like the person you want leading it in the long run because you might need some fresh blood, but they're definitely there leading the charge, and they're in every organization, but most C-suite, I think, don't look for them like they should.
It's interesting. Obviously, we're talking now about a world that is rapidly being disrupted with new technologies, AI and automation. We're seeing huge adoption, or certainly a lot of noise out in the market, and we'll come on to what you're building in a second. But from a established corporate organization, do you see any difference in that, or is that going to be the blocker of adoption of different tools and actually fundamentally finding that efficiency?
Yeah, I think the blocker of tools there's two, I think there's two blockers of tools. One is as I said, like every organization is a shit show of business knowledge, right? And like as a result, leveraging AI is desperately hard. And I think that's one thing that, there's been studies done. There was a groundbreaking study where they took um, cross-functional teams, brought them together to try and help transform the business. And people did not realize that some of the things they've been doing weren't actually put in place on purpose. They just organically developed and were a messy process that like had been going on for 10 years. Everyone thought someone had actually put that in place and it hadn't. And at the same time, during that same study, they found CEOs who just, didn't realize how much of a mess their company was. And I think most of the corporate world is trying to solve the wrong problem with AI. They're
Mm,
looking to AI to come in and make us more efficient when the first thing they should actually be doing is going, right, like, let's look across our organization. Let's look at the mess that it is from a knowledge perspective. So, AI might have something to reference. And then separately to that, but connected, the other barrier to AI adoption is that everyone's just trying to improve workflows.
mm,
But most of these processes are processes that these companies have been doing for 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50 years, right? So you're just adding AI to an historic process of which sometimes it is unbelievably messy. And I think I see a lot of startups come out and it's often like someone was in sales for 10 years, so they've launched a new sales workflow AI app or something like that. And I just think most people don't know how a company works holistically and
Mm,
how messy and unstructured it is. I mean, I'll give you great examples. Like, I'm not going to name them specifically, but you know, very global companies in the Fortune 500, like big companies, C-suite saying, "Why do our sales teams not know what's going on?" And you're sat with the head of sales, and the head of sales is like, well, we don't want the decks they're sending us because they don't work in sales. So we use the ones we were using 5 years ago. Okay, so immediately you've got a problem because sales is communicating product to customer that's 5 years old with messaging that's 5 years old, using language that's 5 years old. And then the C-suite's trying to bring in new product and saying, can you sell this? And sales are saying, well, that's not going to work because of X, Y, Z. Like you see that all of the time.
yeah.
Across global companies. And that's just a snippet, of an example.
Yeah, well, my brother-in-law works in essentially AI and big data in a very large organization, very acquisitive organization, and he says I'm going to have a job for life because just getting the data into a format that they can utilize. And it's not about ideas because the ideas are there. People, oh, we could do this, we could do this. It's great, but actually, can you get the base level, the foundational information in a resource that you can then utilize to build on that? I think that's going to be one of the major issues, certainly for large organizations that have been around for a long time. It's just legacy data, legacy information that's all
Oh,
over the place, different formats, and that's $1 billion problem just to fix that.
oh yeah. I mean, I've never gone into a single company and them ever had a standardized way of tagging metadata. Never, ever. Like it's always a mess. Every department's doing it organically. Someone started it 5 years ago and came up with some terms, and that's how we're going to tag. And someone's doing it over here. And that's from the old days, right? Where like humans were tagging things. Now you want to be in a world like we're in this world at NOAN, where like AI is just automatically tagging
Mm.
what's been created, and but that just gives you an example of like the mess that some of those companies are in. And I think the biggest thing we're going to see with AI is we're going to see a bit of swirl, because I think what we're going to see is C-suite of global companies trying to implement AI to drive cost efficiencies. And then what you're going to see is not the results that people expect because of that, because they're trying to solve the wrong problem.
Yeah,
And
I agree with
that's
that.
what you're going to see people backpedaling. And we kind of saw this with Klarna, right? Like Klarna,
Mm.
I think 700 people and said, right, we're going all in on AI. And then they're like, oh, actually, maybe we're not going all in on AI. And it's ultimately because just an entire new approach is needed to how you think about AI in business.
Well, Sebastian, the founder, the co-founder and CEO of Klarna, actually came out recently saying, when we started to look at the business, we realized that we had all this stuff, but half of it wasn't even being used. It was information about information, it was directional stuff. And we had to get back to first principles before we could actually start doing anything. And I think you're absolutely right. What I see from a market perspective is a lot of hype, but there's also going to be a downward bit going, it's not doing what we thought it was going to do. We fired all these people in this great hype moment of, oh crap, we're going to have to rehire them, rebuild things. And it's that messy middle. It's not the silver bullet that people necessarily think it is. But I mean, look, we could go on forever on this topic. I mean, you were obviously an anomaly. It sounds like you would have had a job for life in terms of helping to try and transform these business. What was the scratch that you had to itch to go and I mean, you had a bit of entrepreneurial stuff. You launched your climbing magazine and things like that, but what was the scratch that you just couldn't resist that I've got to do this?
I think so. One thing for me is that I've always been driven by trying to self-innovate and
Hmm.
do something new and push my own thinking. And that was whether I was in journalism. I got the job I always wanted, a field producer. One of the best jobs on earth doing that job. You're in charge on the ground with the correspondents and cameramen. Brilliant job. But I realized that like I had to evolve what this job meant, and then I wanted to push that. And then I realized that social content meant we had to change platforms and the way we created. So that meant I needed to learn mobile and production for mobile. And then from there, that impacts business models. So then we're going to look at like, okay, how do we think about corporate transformation? So that was my kind of journey through. And I've always been motivated by just trying to innovate my own thinking and push my own thinking. So anomaly, I was working with a lot of amazing global clients. I'm still friends with many of them, brilliant people at great companies. And they've all got fundamental issues that just exist in global companies, like we've talked about. It's just organic, and you can try and solve those all the time. But for me, with the advent of AI, I realized that there was a new way to think about business and approach it. So that was part of it. I think separately, I got to the point in my career where I was coming up to 40. I was, an exec at one of the world's top agencies in New York. But with my past, journalism, that you don't end up with like a lot of equity. You don't end
Mm.
up with equity, so you're getting paid back cash bonuses. And to be transparent, Scott Galloway always says this: if you want to set yourself up, you've got to build your own thing, get equity, and from that. So I'd always wanted to run my own thing. And I was also a little tired of kind of working in the client services
Mm.
world. I wanted to move into the user space and back to the user space, really. And so, that was my main motivating kind of factors. And I think I'd got an opportunity at Anomaly to also, I was leading some entrepreneurial things that they had, some startups that they were spinning off. And the interesting thing about that was that it was a safe way to learn some
Yeah.
of the aspects I didn't know, right? So it was safe for that. But it was also clear to me that one of the reasons agencies fail at spinning off, startups, etc., is that you need to be 100% committed to run something.
Mm.
And most agencies, what they'll do is they'll launch a new IP project, and then the people who are running it also are working on client business. And like you and I know that like if you are entrepreneurial, it does not matter what you do, right? And we see this with our users, but you have to be 100% all in committed. You cannot hedge. You
Mm.
cannot have one foot out the door. You cannot be working on client stuff while you're trying to build it. You need to be all in and focused. And I realized that we were working on some really interesting stuff, but that was the missing link for, that was one of the things I understood. So I had to take the leap and go and launch my own thing. And with that, like NOAN was born really. And NOAN was it was a combination of two things. It was a combination of understanding that there was a new approach to business that actually by thinking about knowledge, we chose NOAN the name because it references knowledge. By thinking about knowledge differently, not as something you reference with
Mm.
AI, but something that drives and controls AI. That was a fundamental shift, right? And then the second thing was that I got to a point where I realized, and there's a lot of people who've worked at agencies that feel this way, but you get to a point where you're working with global clients, some of the biggest business in the world. It's incredible, really, great experience, but it doesn't become very rewarding.
Mm.
It's another major company that you're helping the stock price move on. Whereas actually, like, can you
Making
do
other
this?
people rich. Mm.
Yeah, exactly. And can you do this at scale? Is it possible actually to do this at scale with smaller businesses where it's much more rewarding and you're helping economies at large? And small businesses like 99% of the US economy. Um, can you help? Can you do it at large? And many people I think had that same thought. And I've had friends who messaged me since I founded Known and said, I wish I'd been able to do similar because I've always wanted to help smaller businesses. But with AI, we could scale it.
Mm.
Otherwise you're trying to build a services business and help. It's not possible. It's not scalable. But with AI, we could actually scale it and create a platform that enabled anyone to kind of launch and grow their company with AI. So those were the kind of main driving factors, and that was why I launched Known and jumped ship from Anomaly and moved to Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, you didn't do it by half, did you? You left New York, went to Portugal, and got rid of the big corporate salary to to start up life and scrimping and saving. It's like you say, all in.
Yeah. It's all in, but it's also an interesting trend because, a lot of people don't realize about the US. If you quit your job, you lose your healthcare.
Yeah.
So if you're British or European, it's kind of a strange thing to even consider that walking away from your job, particularly at the time we had two young kids, my wife wasn't working. So walking away from my job meant that we would ultimately lose healthcare. That will pretty much put you $20,000 in the red, right? You've got to find the money for a family of four to pay for healthcare. So, for me, I knew and understood the American market. I am now American. All of my contacts are in the US. Our major focus is in the US, although we're growing UK, Australia. But moving back to Europe is a trend we're seeing across a lot of founders because Europe adds a layer of security
Mm.
that if you've got the American mindset and you have the American contacts and you're building for the American space, you can do that in Europe and you can have healthcare that's cheap and you can have great cost of living and you can be surrounded by great internet here in Portugal, for example, and a really good like accelerator program and support. But you can kind of save yourself from the financial difficulties of trying to build a startup in New York or San Francisco.
Mm.
And at the same time, you can massively reduce your burn because you don't need as higher salaries, and there's a lot of talent here that's really good. So yeah, that was the other really driving factors for moving to Europe. And I'm seeing more and more founders do that, and make that move because for all of those reasons, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. It gives a certain layer of security, like you say, if you've got the mindset. Because we hear Harry Stebbings talking about this 996 idea, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and 6 days a week, and so on. But if you don't have a certain security, I mean, I think that the numbers of people who are going bankrupt in the US because of healthcare bills is incredible. It's a massive danger. So. What's your North Star? You talked about vision earlier. What's your North Star for known?
Well, there's a couple of things. I'd like to talk about the 996 though first. I think the 996 for me was interesting. I saw that from Stebbings and it caused a lot of a stink in the European space. People talking about you don't need to do that. And just the reality that I think European founders need to understand is that 996 is a grind mentality that you
Mm.
have if you live in New York or San Francisco. And that is just life for a lot of people. Like if you're working, because the thing about New York is it's full of its talent across many sectors that is the best in the world at what they do, number one, right? Number two, like you can lose your job, there's 0 hour contracts, so you'll lose your job and you'll be done that day. So
Yep.
everyone's grinding, right? And then number three, you've obviously got the American mindset of anybody can kind of grow and there's no tall poppy syndrome or anything like that. So everyone's trying to be as good as they can. But 996, I saw that and I just thought, oh my God, like that's what we used to do in agency land. Like that was it. That's what most people do. And that was actually, to be honest, is probably not that bad. Actually, 996. I was like looking at it going, man, I remember doing like 7 a.m. until leaving the office at midnight, like
Yeah.
multiple days in a row. And that is like it's quite foundational to the US market that you do those things. And then on top of that, the one thing I've noticed that I think is often lost in tech is that a lot of small business owners do 996.
Mm.
Like we have a lot of users that do 996 because they
Yeah.
run their business and they are overwhelmed and busy, and they're doing the same hours to make their business run and hum. And I don't think it's a brag that like people do that. I actually think that is like it's just if you're European, you need to understand that that is what runs the American economy. It's a serious hustle culture that's very different to Europe.
Yeah, I agree. The US is a very different mindset and attitude to Europeans. I think the other aspect that I've, through some of these conversations I've had on the podcast, that's become clear is the idea of an IP or a moat around what you're building with AI, that is falling away. So speed is really your moat. And
Mhm.
if you're not there trying to get out to market as quickly as possible, you're not going to have the sticky revenue. And I think that's another aspect of it because, and I'm sure you've probably seen it. I think I said to you, are you the idea of the notion killer in that respect? Yeah, but someone's always going to be coming for your lunch as well. And if you're not out there building and growing quickly enough in some people's eyes, you don't have that protective moat. Well, they haven't got the technical capabilities to do that because AI is democratizing that.
Yeah, speed is everything, and it's just exactly right. And I don't necessarily think money equals better speed,
No.
right? I don't think people get faster just because they've got a massive raise. In fact, actually, to be honest, knowing what I know about global companies, that can create swirl.
Mm.
And our goal is to not necessarily scale up our team because I think, if you're trying to automate your business and you're telling people, with NOAN, you've got a superhuman business partner, you can build full scale automation, you know, I can't do that and say that I can't automate my own business with my own platform. So as a result, like I don't want 300 staff. That would be crazy. But I think, yeah, speed is your main moat, really, in reality, at the moment, and that may change, but I think we're seeing some shifts in the way people are understanding what AI can do, and but I do think that is a huge part of it.
It kind of brings us very nicely to the idea of kind of behavioral change as well, because again, one of the things I see with AI is people not necessarily understanding or knowing how to use it. Um, do you see this in your business? Because it's different. People have sort of gotten used to a chat GPT type of idea of how that works. But I mean, in my personal experience, the more you use it, the more you understand its limitations and its weaknesses. I think my wife's a fairly recent user of it, and I see her going, wow, this is amazing. They can do this, that, and the other. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of very basic stuff. But when you start pushing the limits, you realize really where the cracks start to form. But it's a behavior evolution and change. If you've got that experimentation mindset, it's one thing. But I think particularly for entrepreneurs, people that are made redundant and wanting to do something, go, oh, do you know what? I'm going to follow my passion. I'm going to do something different. It's a whole mindset shift for them anyway. Is there an education piece big for you at NOAN?
Yeah, there's a huge level of education around what AI does, how it works. But also then when you're building AI products, the funny thing about what we're building is we're building a product that you can talk to. You
Mm,
asked about a North Star. We want to build a fully automated company that you can control by voice, right? Like that's the goal. And you should be able to talk semantically to it. You shouldn't need prompts or 10 lines, but you shouldn't need to tell it anything. It knows your company. It knows that single source of truth. But as a result, like that's not a workflow product.
mm,
You can get it to do whatever you need it to do. It's ultimately like an employee. And it's funny because when you build workflow products, you can step by step someone through it. Whereas when you drop someone into an experience that really doesn't have like a specific workflow, two things can occur. They don't know what to do, number one. And you see this a lot with ChatGPT, right? Like
mm.
people don't tend to go back from all the data. They might use it a bit. And then actually, there's a lot of people who don't go back.
Yeah.
And then, but the second thing is that or people are doing things that we're like, wow, I didn't realize you could do that. And so you're then having to learn and talk to your users a lot. And I think that's really interesting because our education is coming from building out like community around power users, learning how they're using it, communicating back how we're using it, and what we're doing with it to build our own business.
Yeah.
Education is huge in the AI space. I mean, most people don't even know, it's not even just I mean, this is interesting around entrepreneurship because and this is true for global companies, not just for entrepreneurs, but it's more so true for entrepreneurs, right? Is that most people don't really understand how AI works, number one. Separately, most people don't know what to ask for if they want to build a business.
Yeah.
Right? Like a really good example is someone might know what a value proposition is if they see one, but they
Mm,
wouldn't tell you that is a value proposition or a piece of messaging or like that's a tagline. Even in this is really basic stuff in like business building, right? But like, okay, a subscription model. Like, how do you ask for the right structured subscription model for your business if you don't really understand how subscription models are built, what they are? There's a lot of definitions and things that entrepreneurs don't really know or understand. They might be an expert in one area. And what we're seeing is that there's a level of education which no one is really built for, where you step by step and build out those building blocks of your business. And if you sit someone down in front of an AI where that's not there, they will not give you the right information. And the
yeah.
AI will get the right information to actually help run that company. So there's that layer on top of it, which we call the ontology layer, which is going to be foundational for how all AI products operate in future, is
Yeah.
that they need to know and understand the clear building blocks of business or life or whatever it is, and then you can control them and they can control them too. So there's a layer of education around, what are the blocks that you need,
Yeah.
what how to communicate with AI, like all of that is kind of rolled up into it.
I mean, obviously, hands up. I'm a user of your platform, and I think that's one of the things that I really liked about it is the foundational information that you're putting in, and it's not. I think it's not set and forget because a lot of these things. I mean, I'm doing a project at the moment with a client where they did a piece of work on their vision, mission, values, but it was years ago. It was done by an external consultancy. It sat in a cupboard somewhere, and no one ever looks at it. So when I go in and ask the management team, what is your vision, mission, values? What is your North Star? They're like, I don't know. a bit like you would have had in transformation world. And by having that there, but also having it something that you can play with, you can iterate, you can develop and change and evolve, I think is really valuable because life isn't constant. It's constantly evolving and changing and developing. And it helps the AI to learn more about your business and be very specific.
So I think there's two things that are really important with this, which is the first one is that what we're really talking about here is that back in the day, people would create, and not even back in the day, most companies do, to your point, people create documents that are strategic documents and they get put on a shelf or they're filed away in a drive, right? And we hope that Dave over there in certain department actually understands what that strategy is and executes that strategy, and it 100% will fall apart, but we'll try and get in the direction we can. The difference now is that those blocks on known, for example, the semantics of what's in those blocks are what AI uses to execute for your business.
Mm,
So it really matters. And it matters more than it ever did. And there's going to be a moment where a lot of people, and I think one of the interesting things with AI is that, if you look at ChatGPT's evolution, many of the people who've probably used it the longest might now be coming around to their second year of business, right? And they've been using ChatGPT and they've been getting a bit frustrated because they're back and forthing with it. And all of a sudden their priorities have changed or
mm,
their marketing messaging has changed. And now they're trying to tell it again, like, actually, now we're moving on to this phase. And as a result, what they're trying to do is give it the semantic control for what they need. But you can't do that unless you have that layer that known is. Known
mm,
is the knowledge layer ultimately that powers AIs. And you can use any of the major ones. It uses and chooses which one it needs at the right time. So that is a huge part of why those blocks matter is that it's the semantics and the control that people are looking for in that space.
yeah,
And then the other part of it is just, the for most users traditionally, the creative part of business building would be the execution of the assets.
mm,
And that now is easy because that's taken care of by AI in seconds. So the actual creative part and the strategic part of business building elevates to that semantic layer where that's where you're creative. That's where you decide
yeah,
how your business is going to come to life by AI and how it's going to execute it for you. And that's a fundamental shift from the way most people think about business building.
yeah,
And that's what known is built for, to be the knowledge layer that enables you to control or AI to control your company. And in doing so, a lot of people think it's memory. And I've
mm,
had a lot of conversations with people recently where everyone's talking about AI memory, and I say no. Like memory is the ability to just store and reference lots of information that happened, right? That's ultimately what memory is. But in a business context, what we're actually talking about is fact control because you're actually updating bits of that memory and you're saying, no,
mm,
this year's quarterly goals are not X from last year. They're new quarterly goals that are this year. There's set things within business that stay the same but change over time, right?
yeah,
They're the blocks. And so what we're really talking about is fact control, and that plus semantics are what drive an AI built business, an AI native business. And that is what Known is built for and what we've designed it for. And that's why the assistant can update blocks for you. It can make changes for you because ultimately we want you to be able to talk to it and say, hey, this year I want to increase my prices 5%.
mm.
And the assistant goes, no problem, I'll increase your prices. It changes the pricing block. And then all of a sudden your prices update wherever you've integrated Known. That's the world that we're moving towards and very close to.
I was going to ask you actually, because you've been fairly disparaging online at times about, AI wrappers not being true AI. How do you differentiate it with known from, because you're using some of these foundational models as well, but
I wouldn't say I've been disparaging. I mean, there's some things where I've said, like, you can clearly see that, people are putting a very simple one-dimensional AI wrapper on it, and they're not fundamentally changing the way people behave or behaviors. Ultimately, it's features. I actually think the AI wrapper is, people say it's like products of the AI wrapper. Well, when well done, when it's got specialized knowledge, when it's got distinct workflows or features and functionality for sectors, that's where the value lies. The value does not lie in the models, right? Like, and Benedict Evans, who's obviously, a major thought leader in the space, you'll see him put out similar.
mm,
He put something out recently saying like, is OpenAI like the big wrapper? they're like scrapping around trying to create features that work for everybody. When the people who are getting the real value are the ones that are focused on sectors and use cases. And yeah, I mean, for me, the only challenge with rappers is you'll see a lot of people do really basic stuff that you
Mm.
can really just spin up on Lovable in seconds. And it takes a lot of thought to architect a truly AI native product. And the area of rappers that I'm more disparaging on is just simple RAG, right? Like, I think that is just people just do not understand how AI works. If they're just referencing documents, you're just creating more of a mess.
Yeah.
Like, that's actually where the rat that to me is the problem. So, and people will default to like, oh, well, you can now connect to all your Google Docs, and I'm like, great, they're just a heap of shit. That's great. And Ethan Mollick put out on
I've
LinkedIn.
made that mistake myself. So
Well, exactly. And then all of a sudden, like, some document you've got in there that's like contaminating it because there's a load of personal stuff you saved in Drive, and like, and there's stuff from 5 years ago that's not actually relevant anymore and you've moved on from. That part of it, like the RAG aspect of it, and just saying, hey, this is the memory, that's great. I think that is a real problem and has sucked a lot of oxygen out of the room because people are talking about memory. Ethan Mollick the other day put something out which I thought was great, where he was saying, look, ChatGPT talk about their memory and how they're expanding it and everything else, but actually makes the output worse
yeah,
because it
yeah,
just
and, as I say, the mistake I've made with these things is you kind of dump everything in and just expect it to figure it out. You've got to be much more intentional and structured about it. And I think that's, again, it's a lazy way of doing it. I've been guilty of this, of saying, there you go, here's everything, figure it out kind of thing. But that's not how it works.
I think the biggest misleading like myth that's come out of AI is that AI finally makes sense of unstructured data, right? Which was a big thing. Everyone's like, wow, AI can make sense of unstructured data. And that is true, right, to an extent. But the problem with how LLMs work and models work is that um, it can't do that if there's two versions of the truth.
Yeah.
And I wrote something recently where I said it's a bit like walking down the street and asking one person where the pub is. And they say, right, go down to the end, turn right, walk 400 meters, and it's on your left. And you're like, great, like single source of truth. One person tells you where it is. Great, I know where the pub is. And then you walk down the street and there's 100 people who all start shouting at you at the same time where they think the pub is, and 95% of them are wrong, but it's all at the same time. That's ultimately what you're asking AI
Yeah.
to work out, right? If you connect it to a load of docs and say, here's my memory, is like, which way's the pub? Like, I don't know. Like, I've got all these, and it's going to guess because that's ultimately the type of machine that it is. It's going to guess which direction is right. And I find that analogy helpful, number one, because most people have experienced where the pub is. Uh, but number two is because, I think people don't think of information that they're feeding AI.
Mm.
They think about what AI can do with information, but they're not focused on the knowledge that they give AI. And I
Yeah.
tell people this is a knowledge game. Like, this is all about structure of the knowledge and the architecture of your knowledge and how you do that and what AI knows and understands. That's the most important thing. That will be the most important thing over the next 15, 20 years is knowledge control and distribution at scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's ultimately what will be the most important thing, I think. And the models are, there's going to be thousands within 5 to 10 years. And if not, there's probably are already, but thousands, and they're ultimately infrastructure and they're a commodity. And knowledge will be incredibly important. And then the flows and workflows that work for different sectors that help you manage whatever you need in those sectors will be probably the most important things I think that are developed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One final question from me, because we could go on for forever. How important is it? I mean, you're a surfer, climber. How important is it to have some of these more physical, outside of work escapes in order to keep you focused and on your game? Because burnout is real and it's it can be intense.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a timely one for me because to be transparent, I've surfed all my life. I've climbed all my, for 25 years longer, actually. And, for the last year, I dropped both of those things. And I'd actually taken a long break from climbing just because of burnout of climbing itself. But, I've been surfing hard for the last like 6 years. I live in a world-class surf zone. And because of what I'm building, I'm on 18 hours. I'll be at my desk sometimes at 7 a.m., 5 a.m., sometimes even 4 a.m., and I'm working through until midnight, and it's not healthy,
Mm,
and I'm not giving myself the break. Um, and so I've realized that actually I need to, every day move. And it's funny because I was just talking to my wife about this. I haven't run for years, and actually somewhat inspired by yourself and one of our other um, old friends who runs a startup, a guy called Rob Fell. I was inspired to get out and start running again. So I went and bought myself some running shoes the other day. And, for me now, I've got running, surfing, climbing, and I try and move every single day,
yeah.
and I think that's important. I think one of the things that I find though that's interesting, the reason I surf and climb, and I don't get this with running, but the reason I surf and climb is because of the ultimate flow state and the being in the now.
Mm,
Both of those sports bring you right to the now. I'm a time obsessive. I'm obsessed with the nature of time and um, particularly how you can manipulate it by doing those kind of sports. And there's
mm,
some great books on that. But for me, I chase the feeling of being in the now. And that's one of the reasons I loved foreign news, because
mm.
you're never more than in the now than when you're in a foreign country getting rocketed, shot at, bombed, and like all you can control is your own behavior. You are just ultimately in the now. And the high you get from that is incredible. But the focus you get, and then afterwards, for me, um, it gives me a bit of clarity on what I want to do. Like I try and find things that are going to get me in the now because then you can actually let go of the work stresses. I don't get this with running because the work stuff is still going through my head. Some people do, elite runners will get it. I've got friends who run at a high level and they get into a flow state. It's just not me. I don't get that. My brain will tick over for the whole run. But
I think you need to get into the endurance side of
yeah,
running. I did a half marathon the other day, and after what 10, 15K, you do your mind flips in and out of these things, but you do certainly get into certain stages where it's just like I just need to get through these next couple of kilometers because otherwise I'm going to stop. And I think that's that I agree with you that that's kind of everyone finds it in their own way, right?
yeah,
But I think that's one of the ways that I find it. I think it's really important to have these escapes as well, like you say, and build that focus and get back into your own world rather than
yeah, definitely.
stay at the desk. But Neil, thank you so much for joining me today on this valuable conversation. Really enjoyed it. I'll drop a referral link down below. So if you want to try out NOAN, click on the link. 7-day free trial. There's a university of videos of how to get set up and make the most out of it. I think time to value is critical when we're talking about AI because that's where people, I think, start to lose interest is when they don't see the value coming quick enough. So I think that university is a fantastic idea. But thanks so much, Neil, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks for having me.